Hello, my name is Joanna Coleman, and I'm a lecturer at the National University of Singapore, or NUS. I'm also a wildlife ecologist and conservation biologist who specializes in urban wildlife in general and bats in particular. Recently, I was asked to give a special talk at an outreach event that the NUS Faculty of Science was putting on for junior college students. I decided to talk about biodiversity in an increasingly urban world, or from jungle to concrete jungle. I hope you enjoy my talk and learn something from it. So to start with, let me ask, when you think about biodiversity, what kinds of places come to mind? Do you picture something like this? Or maybe this? Or perhaps you picture the tropical rainforest. It's the most complex of terrestrial habitats with the most species per unit area, the epitome of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is not static. Because of natural selection, just as new species are continually appearing, others are dying out. So there's a normal background rate of extinctions. But once in a while, along comes an event called a mass extinction, when large proportions of all life forms are killed off. And after each one, it takes a long time, about 1,000,000 years, for biodiversity to recover. It's already happened 5 times, most recently 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs disappeared. Now we are experiencing another one, the 6th extinction. Most scientists agree that it may wipe us out too, because we are so dependent on other life forms for the ecosystem services they provide. For the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the degradation of our waste. The scale of this event is massive, and this table really only shows the tip of the iceberg for 2 reasons. 1, these numbers are only for species known to science, yet most species on Earth remain undiscovered. 2, for all these groups in gray, the status has only been assessed for a small proportion of species. According to the World Wildlife Fund, vertebrate populations, meaning numbers of individuals, decreased by more than half from 1970 to 2010, and this decline has been 1.5 times greater in the tropics than in temperate regions. The 6th extinction is also unique because whereas previous events have had various cataclysmic causes, such as a meteor impact, this time, we are undeniably the cataclysm. We are changing our planet in many ways, one of which is urbanization. Now, this is the process by which towns and cities form, and it's the increase in proportions of people living in urban areas. Of course, we have very good reasons for moving from rural areas to cities. We want jobs, education, better healthcare, housing, and sanitation. After all, urbanization goes hand in hand with economic development. But we must ask ourselves, at what cost? Urbanization has been identified by several scientists as the #1 anthropogenic factor in extinctions and endangerments of species. Why does it so strongly influence biodiversity? Well, it drastically alters how we interact with the natural world, and that's what this talk is all about. First, let me mention an important person in conservation, Edward O. Wilson. He's called the father of biodiversity because he introduced the term. In his 2002 book, The Future of Life, he proposed the acronym HIPPO to represent the 5 main threats to biodiversity. So, habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, population growth, and overharvesting. In 2010, he was asked where climate change fits in. He said, it's a very big H. And here's one reason why I'm so dedicated to urban ecology and conservation. Basically, I believe that of all the various human activities, none epitomizes the HIPPO acronym quite like urbanization does. So let's break it down, and we'll start with habitat destruction, which is the conversion of habitats to human land uses. We convert them to uses such as mining, agriculture, logging, and urban areas. And when you consider that altogether urban areas only occupy less than 3% of all the land on Earth, their impacts on biodiversity seem disproportionately large. One reason is that no other human land use causes this kind of profound and irreversible change. You know, once we lay down concrete and asphalt, there's no going back. Now for species invasions. This is what can happen when a species is introduced into a habitat outside its natural range. In its native habitat, its various relationships with the environment and other species that are its predators, prey, and competitors keep its populations in check. But in its new habitat, conditions are different. For instance, maybe it finds itself without natural predators, or maybe it encounters a greater availability of food. As a result, it establishes itself in such large numbers that it displaces native species. Urbanization both increases the frequency of introductions and creates areas of habitat that are favorable to invasive species. And a classic example is overpopulation of domestic cats in many cities. Next, pollution. The main sources of atmospheric contaminants, such as cars, factories, and burning of waste, are most concentrated in cities. And the influx of people into urban areas is happening so fast that it is exceeding the capacity of the existing infrastructure. And so a lot of the waste generated by dense human populations ends up in the water, along with all kinds of toxic chemicals. Finally, urban soils usually contain all kinds of foreign substances, including construction debris and pesticides. The second P was for overpopulation. The global human population now exceeds 7 billion, and we recently passed a major milestone, the point at which half of all people were living in cities. And that figure continues to grow. The UN predicts that by 2050 it will swell to 72% of all humans. And finally, overconsumption. Urbanization has brought huge changes in lifestyle, especially the rise of consumerism, which reflects improved living standards. And our demand for electricity, fuel, and all manner of consumer goods is insatiable. So, like I said, the 5 key threats to biodiversity are exemplified within urban areas. But these impacts don't stop at municipal boundaries. In fact, cities affect regional and global biodiversity. This problem is exacerbated by urban sprawl, which is how many cities grow, expanding faster in area than in population. As you might imagine, sprawl increases our use of cars. It also increases wastage of electricity because as energy travels along transmission lines, some of it is naturally lost, and this loss increases with distance, such as to reach people living on the edges of ever-expanding cities. Naturally, increasing urbanization and especially sprawl also brings us closer to protected areas, which threatens the organisms that live in them. Already, 25% of the world's protected areas are less than 17 kilometers from a city of at least 50,000 people. And the average distance between protected areas and cities is shrinking. By 2030 in East Asia, it will be half of what it was in 1995, and 25% of protected areas will be within 10 kilometers of a city. Another problem is that few cities produce everything they need, instead consuming huge amounts of resources from more faraway places. For example, some of the timber used in cities around the world comes from unregulated forestry in Southeast Asia. Even closer to home, our city is already mostly built up and will continue to grow on reclaimed land. The sand needed for this reclamation comes from our neighbors, including Cambodia, where the dredging is already devastating marine and river ecosystems. And this leads into an important concept, the ecological footprint, or how much biologically productive land and water it takes to provide all the ecosystem services used by people and all our activities. And one thing's for sure, urbanites have the biggest footprints. This is especially true for countries such as Singapore that have few natural resources and so must import most everything. Last year, WWF published per capita ecological footprints of 152 nations, and, not surprisingly, Singapore ranked 7th. Basically, if everyone on Earth lived like one of us, then it would take 4.1 planets to meet our needs. Now we can illustrate this with one of the most quintessential Singaporean delicacies. To make chili crab, you need all these ingredients, and only one of them, the eggs, might be sourced directly from Singapore. So just this one dish has a huge footprint. As we become more and more urbanized, our growing affluence also threatens biodiversity outside the city in other ways. For one, the richer we are, the more meat we eat, and livestock production is the most environmentally damaging form of agriculture. For another, wildlife is highly desirable on the menus of urbanites in Asia and Africa and their nationals abroad, and this is driving unsustainable hunting, legal or not, on the edges of cities and farther away. This includes items such as shark fin and bird nest, both of which are highly valued by Chinese people in urban areas. And then there's the trade in plants and animals for pet, ornamental, medicinal, and other uses, mainly to satisfy Asian urbanites and involving importation of species. For example, Chinese demand drives a huge trade in Southeast Asian wildlife, and actually it's the biggest threat to the survival of some of our species, such as the Sunda pangolin. Despite all the above, cities are home to lots of organisms as long as they can deal with some unique challenges. One of these is the abundance of roads, which can have various effects on biodiversity. First, where there was once permeable ground cover, such as vegetation, now there is impervious pavement, with one obvious implication being that plants don't grow as well in pavement as they do in soil. Also, because water doesn't absorb into pavement like it does into soil, surface runoff increases, bringing inputs of contaminants into water bodies. Second, roads are major conduits for introductions of invasive species, particularly plants. Third, roads can be a death trap for animals, and roadkill can be a pretty big problem in cities. Many species won't even approach roads. Either way, roads can therefore be barriers to movement with dire consequences. For example, during Singapore's rapid development, Bukit Timah and Central Catchment nature reserves became the last strongholds for many species, including the banded leaf monkey. However, construction of the BKE in 1983 effectively prevented the monkeys from moving between the two reserves, and they disappeared from Bukit Timah. All that's left now is a relic population of about 40 monkeys in Central Catchment, and such small populations are prone to extinction. Another issue is the presence of buildings, particularly glass. This threatens birds, which often fly into windows. A study from last year estimated that window collisions kill up to nearly 1 billion birds per year in North America. Mortality is highest during seasonal migration, at high rises, and in urban areas. And although this problem elsewhere in the world hasn't been studied yet, it happens everywhere, including right here at NUS. And let's not forget that the city is an unnaturally bright place for nocturnal animals, which are affected by artificial lighting in diverse ways. For example, lights can attract large swarms of insects, many of which die from exhaustion or direct contact with the light, not to mention become more vulnerable to predation. Now, this of course means that some predators, such as some bats, benefit from this, but overall, for most bats, and indeed most animals, light pollution seems quite detrimental. We know, for example, that it can mess up the timing of animals' activities and severely reduce the ability of sea turtles to reproduce. Not only is the city really bright, but also it's loud, and that can be hard to cope with. Many studies find that in order to be heard over the constant noise, urban birds and frogs alter their vocalizations in terms of timing, pitch, or volume. Urban noise can also interfere with the ability of bats to hunt using echolocation, and these are just some of the effects. Animals in urban areas also have to contend with novel predators. Earlier, I mentioned how domestic cats can become invasive. Well, turns out they're also devastatingly efficient predators. How big a problem is this? A study from 2013 estimated that every year between 1.3 and 4 billion birds in the US alone die due to cat predation, making this the top anthropogenic cause of mortality for birds. For small mammals, the problem is even worse, and cats kill hundreds of millions of reptiles and amphibians. The main culprits are unowned cats, and most victims are native species. And the problem is most severe in urban areas. But cats aren't the only novel predators. A surprising problem in cities is the presence of litter, which can function as a sort of predator when animals get trapped in it. Now, all the animals shown here were rescued and survived, although Peanut the turtle couldn't be released. But most victims are not so lucky, and it's estimated that this kills nearly 70,000 animals every year in the UK alone. As if all this weren't problematic enough, there's the added problem related to where we like to put our cities. These maps show how most current and future urban development is in or near biodiversity hotspots, the most biodiverse but threatened areas on Earth. And this happens because the same conditions that promote high biodiversity are also attractive to us. So, just like many other species, we want to be where it's nice and warm and near the water. Conservation International identified 34 hotspots. They are especially worth conserving because many of their species are endemics, meaning not found anywhere else, and they've already lost most of their original habitat. And of all regions on Earth, Southeast Asia is the hottest because all our land and coastal waters lie entirely within 4 hotspots. And, as you may know, this is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, where urbanization is happening on a massive and unprecedented scale. Sure, rapid urbanization has promoted economic and social development, but not without taking quite a toll on biodiversity. The evidence of that is that, globally speaking, the likelihood that any species is on the IUCN Red List, meaning assigned some level of threat, is correlated with the level of urbanization in its geographic range. Regionally speaking, the late Navjot Sodhi, who was a prof at NUS, and his co-authors measured that correlation for vertebrates and plants in Southeast Asian nations. On this figure, the urban percentage of each country's population is on the x-axis, and the percentage of its species on the red list is on the y-axis. And the more urbanized nations, such as Malaysia and the Philippines, have proportionally more red-listed species than the less urbanized nations, such as Laos. So that's the national level, but we can zoom in a bit. A study from 2011 analyzed data from 92 cities around the world and found that the diversity of terrestrial animals decreases inside cities. We also know that diversity of plants in cities is more often correlated with the size of their human populations than with the amount of land they occupy, and that older cities have more plant species than younger ones do. So what determines these within-city patterns? Is it us? For plants, maybe. We are, after all, the ones who establish and maintain urban plants. But for other organisms, we have minimal direct impact on whether they occur in a city or not, and where in a city they occur. I mean, even our very best efforts to control or eradicate pests cost huge amounts of time and money and have limited success. In the end, animal diversity is mainly determined by natural processes, and urban plants are the stage on which that happens. So, we control the plants, but the rest, not so much. And this leads to common, noticeable patterns of biodiversity within cities. One is related to socioeconomics, specifically the observation that wealthier neighborhoods tend to have greater diversity of plants and birds. Another relates to the level of urbanization, which is a spectrum. At the high end are areas such as the CBD or industrial zones with very little natural habitat. At the low end are reserves or patches of natural habitat. Now, you might expect biodiversity to be highest in the least urbanized sites and lowest in the most urbanized sites. But surprisingly, studies often find maximum biodiversity at intermediate development, as in low-density residential areas, managed parks, and golf courses. In Singapore, managed parks were found to have more species of butterflies than isolated patches of forest did. However, it's important to realize that this increased diversity at intermediate development occurs largely because conditions in these sites are tolerated by both introduced and native species. And so proportions of exotic species in urban parks can be quite high. And as exotic species become more common in cities, some say urbanization is creating a new epoch, called the Homogenocene or New Pangea. And I'm not talking about the nightclub at Marina Bay Sands. If you're not familiar with the term Pangea, it refers to how Earth's land surface looked about 200 million years ago. Back then, there were no oceanic barriers to prevent flora and fauna moving about freely. But the tectonic plates move continuously, and the amazing diversity of life and geographic differences in life forms of today are mostly due to the breaking up of Pangea into continents, where life then evolved in isolation. So, the new Pangea refers to the fact that urbanization is basically removing those oceanic barriers between what were previously distinct biogeographic regions. And it's happening because, as I've said, urbanization promotes the establishment of exotic species. But also, the removal of these barriers is promoted by the homeostatic nature of cities. And by that, I'm referring to the fact that basically all cities around the world look pretty much alike. Obviously, there's some variation, but they all tend to be pretty similar when it comes to things like proportions of the land covered by pavement, by trees, by grass. And the result is a phenomenon called biotic homogenization, where flora and fauna of different locations become more similar than predicted based on geography. So, suppose you compared two similar habitats, for example, rainforests, in terms of their large fruit-eating birds. Naturally, you'd expect them to be less alike the farther apart they are. In other words, a rainforest in Thailand should have more species in common with a rainforest in Indonesia than with one in Ecuador. Well, we can measure this degree of similarity using a statistic called Jacquard's index. The higher the value, the more alike two sites or communities are. A study in 2006 looked at how Jacquard's index changed with increasing distance, so that's on the x-axis, for communities of birds in natural and urban habitats. So those are the green points and the gray points. And each one of these points is one Jacquard's index for one pair of locations, and I've named 3 examples. Basically, the study found that Jacquard's index declined rapidly with distance for natural habitats, just as expected, but not for urban habitats. So, a suite of cosmopolitan species is replacing more sensitive species, and the world's urban biota is becoming homogenized. In other words, a few winners are replacing many losers. And just who are these winners and losers? Many studies propose classifying species into 3 categories according to their response to urbanization: urban avoiders, adapters, and exploiters. And a key trait that separates them is how much they rely on human resources. Urban avoiders are the most sensitive, native species mostly, and they only use natural resources. They're the first ones to disappear from cities. So they include large predators, which people don't really like to live with all that much, species with large territories or that live deep within the forest, and species that are sensitive to the presence of people and pets. Urban adapters can live in small patches of habitat and/or altered environments. Most of them are native species, and they don't have very specialized requirements. They can use human resources, but don't need to. Urban exploiters are the most reliant, sometimes entirely, on human resources, and they can reach huge population sizes in cities. They are the most homogenized species, and most of them are introduced. And partly because of our conflicts with some urban exploiters, many people perceive urban wildlife as undesirable and nature as being fundamentally incompatible with urbanization. In fact, urbanization is profoundly affecting our attitudes toward the natural world. In 2005, Richard Louv, a journalist and author, introduced the phrase nature deficit disorder to describe a collection of issues that are increasingly common. They include depression, attention deficit disorder, myopia, obesity, and, most important to biodiversity, a reduced connection with and respect for the natural world. Nature deficit disorder has various causes, but all are linked to urbanization. First is our increased reliance on technology, particularly the belief that technology can solve all our problems and the increased amounts of time we spend staring at screens. Second is the cultivation of what we call biophobia. This is very different to biophilia. That's our innate curiosity about and love of nature. However, the media and adults instill in kids the notion that the world out there is somehow dangerous and should be feared. Third is a cultural devaluing of nature. In other words, lessons and tuition are prioritized over unstructured play, and we no longer understand that we are part of nature and that it is essential to our well-being. Just think how relevant this is to Singapore. The urban proportion of the population sits at 100%, and the rate of myopia is higher here than in any other nation. Also, as the MOE rightly points out, helicopter parenting is a major issue. Too many of my students grew up sheltered from all possible risks and not playing outside independently like I did, climbing trees, collecting insects, handling soil, riding a bike, going swimming. Many are afraid of getting dirty, of the ocean, of trekking, in short, of the natural world. Finally, we have what is called a post-apocalyptic view of the future, in which nature is the problem, not the solution. In other words, the main environmental challenges, such as climate change and the loss of biodiversity, seem overwhelming. Human societies, mainly urban ones, have essentially accepted the vision that we are headed for doom and it's too late to change course. But I disagree with that vision, and despite the negative effects of urbanization on biodiversity, it offers huge opportunities for positive change. The Rio +20 UN Conference on Sustainable Development emphasized that urbanization can promote socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable societies, if it goes hand in hand with good design and development. So, if a city is well planned, it can house a large human population in relatively little space. And this leads to better quality of life, more efficient use of resources, and the preservation of larger natural areas that can provide habitat for biodiversity. So let's look at some examples. First of all, according to predictions, if we want to feed all the people predicted to be living in cities in 2050, we better double the global food supply. To do that, without doing major additional damage to the environment in non-urban areas, is a huge challenge. Fortunately, there are untapped opportunities in cities. For example, good urban planning should incorporate measures to shift from relying on imported goods and services to using resources found inside cities. And these can include reducing waste and the consumption of water and meat, and implementing urban agriculture even where space is limited, like it is in Singapore. Now, this process is helped by local government policies. For example, in Kampala, Uganda, ordinances were enacted in 2004, and ever since, half of all households are producing safe, high-quality produce. Second, even though biotic homogenization is real, the fact is most species in cities are still native. A recent analysis of data from many cities around the world found that on average, 2/3 of plant species and up to 94% of birds in urban areas are native. What about our natural heritage? Although most of Singapore's biodiversity disappeared during colonization, there's still a lot to discover. In fact, studies done between 2000 and 2010 found more than 500 species new to Singapore, with more than 100 new to science. And often, cities can harbor threatened organisms, just like the Singapore freshwater crab. Now, as you might imagine, in order to conserve native biodiversity in cities, we need good habitat. In a best-case scenario, tracts of natural habitat are not just left intact, but also protected from future development. So, urban greening is good, especially from the standpoint of mitigating climate change and pollution. But ideally, green spaces should be large with native vegetation. Those spaces become havens for native species, as is the case in Bukitima and Central Catchment. And one thing that really helps is connecting fragmented or isolated patches of habitat, and there are lots of great ways to do that. For example, planting trees with overarching canopies can help animals cross roads and provide habitat when the roadside planting mimics the natural layering of forests. Other types of ecolinks, such as underground tunnels and vegetative overpasses, are also useful. And these efforts can complement the roles played by protected areas. Having lots of green space and native biodiversity also goes a long way toward attacking the fundamental drivers of many of our environmental problems, human attitudes. We know that access to green spaces is associated with improved human well-being, and part of that is offering people the chance to get closer to nature. The more that adults and kids get outside and enjoy the natural world, the more we all care. In many instances, concern for biodiversity is viewed as independent of and less important than pressures such as poverty, unemployment, and access to food, water, sanitation, and housing. And many urbanites still live in abject poverty. However, urbanization is often associated with better healthcare, education, and economic development. And as the standard of living increases, so do the resources available for conservation. In other words, cities are where we are most likely to find the knowledge, innovation, and human and financial capital needed to develop solutions to sustainability. Remember, more than 60% of the area that is projected to be urban in just 15 years has yet to be built, and more than half of this urban development will take place in Asia. We need to seize these unprecedented opportunities to improve sustainability and explore how cities can be good stewards of biodiversity. Thank you.